Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to another glorious episode of The Crab Tribe. Today, I want to try a little something different and talk generally about some interesting cards and why I like them and what you could do with them. I previously referenced the card Topsy Turvy in another video, and it inspired this video to try to find some cards that are legal and do similar things by messing with the rules of the game. And so these are kind of like the rule breaker cards. So hopefully you find some of this interesting and you can construct a deck and take advantage of it. And so yeah, I'm mostly thinking of Commander, but I guess you could use these type of synergies in other decks as well, other formats. So the first card here is the Eon Engine. And it doesn't appear as much at first. It just reverses the game order from clockwise, counterclockwise, and vice versa. So that could be good if the next player after you would win the game. You could stop them, at least for a cycle. But one thing you can do with it is you could copy it and then have an unwinding clock. And then the next turn it becomes untapped and you can activate the copy. And then just keep copying every turn, I guess. So it's just you and another person playing. Or you could just decide which person doesn't play, if that's your thing. And here's just one way you can do this combo. And you could also do this, replacing the clock with a Seaborn Muse. If you had a Karn and the War of Spark Saheeli, you could make the copy that way. So that's just the first card. Just it's a reverse card, but you could use it like a skip card if you wanted. And speaking of skip cards, there are cards that straight up end the turn, and they skip all remaining phases, exile all spells and abilities currently on the stack, and the active player has to discard down to max hand size, and anything that says until end of turn is ended. So this is like Discontinuity, Time Stop, Glorious End, and this new one, Hurrick's Final Meditation, Hercules. So that one actually has the added effect that it's like a Cyclonic Rift. So surprised that one's not getting more attention. But that's pretty cool. So there's also two permanent cards that do the same thing. That is Sundial the Infinite and Obeka. Sundial, though, you can only use for your turns, and Obeka is a May ability. So outside of your turn, it is just for politics, I suppose. So that's okay, though, because we're still going to use it. So the instant cards, though, you could use to cut your opponent's turn short, and that would avoid some in-step triggers. Like if you didn't want the slime counters from Atroxel, you didn't want Marin to get a card or Prosper to get a card, you could just end their turn prematurely. So also, these cards would mess up Storm decks because they exile all the spells on the stack, not just the one. And actually, you could think of them like hard counters, because technically, even though they're not being countered, the turn's just ending, so they don't have a chance to resolve anyway. So something actually that says it can't be countered, like a Dovin's Veto or a Hull Breacher, this actually gets around it because it's not countering the spell, it's just ending the turn. So that's an interesting caveat of it. And so Glorious in there actually has a fairly bad drawback, you would think, because it says you would end the turn, you would lose the game at the end of the next end step. Oh, but wait, Obeka can just skip that end step. And you could use just one of the other instants to just get around that, because you can never get to the end step. And actually, Red has a lot of extra turn spells, or by a lot, I guess I mean about 5, that say you lose the game at the end of the next end step. So, like, Chance for Glory, Last Chance, Warrior's Oath, and Alchemist's Gambit. And so then instead of losing the game, you can just skip that end step, so you never get to the end step. You don't lose the game And you can just do that actually infinitely because you could imprint one of those 2-cost ones like Warrior's Oath. Um, and because it's a 2-cost, the Isochron Scepter allows you to imprint it, and then you can just constantly do it forever using Sundial the Infinite. Also, this works with Phage, Phage the Untouchable, because you can cast her from your graveyard or your command zone. And normally it would say if you cast it anywhere from other than your hand, you would lose the game. But in response to that trigger, that ETB trigger, you just end the turn, so that triggered ability does not resolve, or it doesn't have a chance to resolve. So if you want to make Phage your commander, that's one way you could do that. And I think that's all pretty neat. And then next up we have the Eon Hub. The Eon Hub is what I called here the tax evasion card, because if you don't like paying taxes, you can simply skip it. Because it says all players skip their upkeep, so any kind of trigger that would happen on the upkeep is skipped. And that's good because there are a lot of older cards that have upkeep cost, and you can just get around those and have insanely powerful creatures and enchantments on the battlefield, and they stay on the battlefields indefinitely rather than just a few turns. So like Mystic Remora, Contamination, like Naked Singularity, Sustaining Spirit, and then this land here, it would have an age counter put on it, and you have to pay the life every turn. It gets kind of taxing, but we can just skip that tax and just never take any damage. So I love Glacial Chasm, and this is just one way to really take advantage of it. And it also gets around cards, a lot of the alt win cards. They say at the beginning of your upkeep, if X is true, then you win the game. Kind of like Happily Ever After, Mechanized Production, Simic Ascendancy, and then this Feldar Sovereign. Since those players would never get to their upkeep, it's skipped. All those cards are kind of useless, so you can screw over decks that are built around that. This also is like a protection against certain curses and player enchantments. So like Captive Audience would have really no effect on you. But there's something else, because the Eon Hub makes certain cards extra free. So like Pact and Negation and Summoner's Pact here, and then all the rest of these, there's one for every color that are free to cast, but then they have an upkeep cost your next turn. But since we skip our upkeep, we never actually pay that cost. So these are just extra free cards. So that's really good. It's one way you can take advantage of Eon Hub. And then kind of the opposite is the Paradox Haze, which gives you an additional upkeep. So this one actually is an enchant player, so it only affects one person. And probably you'd want to choose yourself, especially if you're one of these commanders. So Jorah, they're actually the suspend counters. You take one off during your upkeep, but if you have an additional upkeep, you would, you just speed up those cards you put out. And there's a Simic guy, I forgot his name, from Baldur's Gate, that also revolves around suspend. Also the Charismatic Bridge and Sheored, the Whispering one. You can just get 2 upkeeps there, and that is pretty good. So you could build an entire upkeep tribal trigger deck. I'm sure there's a lot of decks like that online. But you could also stack up on curses and player enchantments and just bully one person with this. Here's just some examples. But if you enchant it yourself, you might help yourself out by filling up your graveyard there with Fray Insanity, or you get 2 big scary creatures out. I guess if your deck has big scary creatures. I guess the downside of enchanting someone else is you don't know what their deck is, so it might not be as effective, but that's an option as well. And then you have some lazy permanent cards. These cards freeze everything because they say all players skip their untap step. And there's a lot of instants and sorceries that say, you you tap all creatures they control, and they don't untap until the end of your next turn or something like that. But these are the only two I could find that actually indefinitely skip the untap. And that's generally a bad thing because it includes yourself. But like I said in the beginning, there's cards like Seaborn Muse, Unwinding Clock that can get around that. But the interesting thing here is phasing is really affected here because permanents phase out and phase in if they had phasing. But if they are phased out, they will phase in on the beginning of the next untap step. And actually that reminder text is on most printings of Teferi's Protection. So if players would skip their untap, well, then that never occurs. And then those permanents are just phased out forever. They're just stuck in the Shadow Realm there. So I guess one thing you could do, and you could build an entire deck around phasing and just try to make creatures disappear. And Wizards did print quite a few cards recently that help with this, like Teferi, Master of Time, March of the Swirling Mist, and then you could throw in some of these older cards, Ukapose and the Vidalian Illusionist. I kind of thought it funny that Teferi, the Timeless Voyager, his ultimate says that target opponents' creatures don't phase out, or they do phase out and they don't phase in until the beginning of your next turn. So they essentially are phased out for an extra turn. But if you have out Stasis or Sands of Time, then they're actually phased out forever. So it's kind of a redundant text there. Unnecessary text, if you have the right setup. And then finally, Sands of Time is kind of a weird one because it says they skip their untap, so the phasing synergy there still applies, but everything that's tapped becomes untapped, everything that's untapped becomes tapped, except for enchantments or planeswalkers, but those don't really matter usually. So kind of like the card, the theme of the card, it's like an hourglass, they flip. And you can actually take advantage of that in a combo here, where you just float your mana before the trigger resolves, so you have enough to use Lithoform Engine and some extra, and then you copy the trigger of the Sands of Time, and then you just repeat that forever, because that'll also untap the engine. So it'll give you infinite mana, although that's kind of a bad combo, because your mana will fizzle after your upkeep there. So you have to have some other way to take advantage of this, either with like a pinger or, I don't know, a card that can tap and deal damage. And then you could win. But then you don't even need the mana, so I don't know. But yes, that's all the cards that I have for today, and all the cards I could find that were on theme for breaking the rules. Was there something I missed or something that you thought of? I'd love to hear about it. And as always, I hope you have a great day and stay safe.